Anna Miller pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped into the narrow alleyway, the icy wind from the Chicago winter biting at her cheeks and curling strands of her dark hair across her face. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting elongated shadows on the glistening wet pavement. She paused mid-step, sensing a presence she could not yet see, a whisper of unease threading through her chest. Her breath fogged in the frigid air as she muttered under her breath, "Who is that man everyone fears?" The question felt foolish, but the weight of rumors she had overheard, the dangerous, untouchable CEO, Marcus Hale, lingered in her mind, tugging at her curiosity. Snow began to settle on the worn cobblestones, softening the harsh outlines of the city around her, and in the shifting shadows, she caught the briefest shimmer of movement. A figure emerged, tall and silent, his silver eyes catching the weak glow of the street lamps and reflecting it like steel in the dark. He moved with a precision and quiet command that made the alley seem to contract around him. She froze, instinctively pressing her back against the brick wall, her heart thudding in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, yet the magnetic tension of his presence held her rooted, a dangerous curiosity bubbling inside her. Snowflakes brushed against his shoulders as he stopped a mere few feet away, the silence between them heavy, charged. His gaze did not leave her, yet it was not accusatory. It was measured, unreadable, commanding without a word. Anna's breath caught when he tilted his head slightly, a subtle motion that suggested awareness, perhaps even recognition. The alley felt smaller, the air denser, every sound amplified, the distant honk of a cab, the crunch of snow beneath their feet, the faint whistle of the wind around the corners of the buildings. She shifted, taking a cautious step backward, and he mirrored her movement, maintaining the distance yet closing the emotional space between them with unspoken authority. The tension hung thick as she realized he was more real, more imposing, and yet somehow more intriguing than the whispers had suggested. Every flicker of his expression, every tilt of his stance, carried a silent narrative, a story of power entwined with restraint. Her pulse raced, and she realized she was holding her breath, waiting for a cue, any signal that might dissolve the magnetic pull of fear and fascination she felt. The snow continued to drift softly around them, each flake catching the dim light, framing him as a spectral figure of control and danger, yet somehow intimate in the stillness. She dared a glance, noting the calm certainty in his posture, the way he seemed to own the alley without raising his voice, and yet there was an unspoken invitation in the steadiness of his stare. Anna could not move, could not speak, and yet she understood that this encounter was not fleeting, that something about his presence demanded her attention and her curiosity. The alley, the snow, the steel-colored eyes, everything combined into a cinematic moment of suspended reality, a pause where danger and fascination coexisted. The wind whispered between the buildings, carrying the faint scent of winter and city, mingling with the low hum of tension that hung in the narrow space. She clenched her hands inside her gloves, feeling the warmth of the leather against her skin, and let the moment stretch, every detail sharpening, the shimmer of snowflakes, the subtle shift in his stance, the unspoken weight of his gaze. Anna's mind raced, questions forming and dissolving as she took another careful step back, and still he remained, a silent guardian of the shadowed street. The scene felt suspended in time, an unresolved beat of curiosity and quiet apprehension, leaving Anna, and the audience, on the edge of anticipation, teetering between fear and fascination, as the unknown of what he might do next hung in the cold, snow-dusted air. The air in Silver Pine Forest was cold, scented with pine and the first hint of morning frost, the way it carried both promise and foreboding. Sarah Vale's heart pounded in her chest as she stood at the edge of the sacred grove, every nerve alert to the stillness around her. The ancient altar rose from the center, carved with symbols older than any living memory, bathed in the silver light of the waning moon. She caught her breath and whispered to herself, "You should not be here alone," recalling the quiet warning that had made her ears burn and her stomach twist with anxiety. A rustle of leaves and a shifting shadow made her freeze, and then she saw him, Cale Thornridge, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, taller and broader than any man she had ever seen, framed by moonlight as though the world itself honored his presence. His hair, dark as midnight, fell around a face that was both cruelly angular and impossibly handsome, and the silver of his eyes reflected every detail of the forest and her fear with an intensity that made her chest tighten. He did not move immediately, merely allowed the air to settle around him, yet the weight of his gaze pressed down, the raw, measured force of a predator sizing its prey. Sarah's pulse quickened as the wind stirred, brushing pine needles across her hands and catching the hem of her simple gown, the night feeling alive with the promise of danger and inevitability. She stepped slightly forward, uncertain, and the faintest whisper of a sound carried to her, his voice, low, cold, commanding, "Come here, little wolf. Let us get this over with." Each word wrapped around her nerves, tethering her to the moment and to him, and she felt the magnetic pull of something far greater than fear alone. Her steps were hesitant, careful, as she approached the altar, each one a battle between instinct to flee and a growing, reluctant fascination that rooted her in place. The frost underfoot crunched sharply, every note echoing in the quiet, and she noticed the absolute stillness of his stance, the way the shadows pooled around him as if bending toward his will. Her fingers flexed nervously, brushing against the fabric of her gown as she tried to steady her racing thoughts, yet she could not tear her eyes away from the silver light reflecting in his gaze. He tilted his head fractionally, a subtle motion that conveyed awareness without invitation, and she felt her body respond, each breath shallow, each heartbeat loud, a rhythm she could not control. A soft gust made the surrounding trees whisper, and for a moment, she imagined the world holding its breath along with her, the forest itself a witness to the charged, suspended tension of their encounter. She dared to shift, the motion cautious, almost imperceptible, and he mirrored her subtly, maintaining the distance yet shrinking the emotional space between them with each silent movement. Snow from the upper branches began to drift lazily, catching the moonlight, and for a moment, it seemed to frame him as both predator and sentinel, impossible to read yet commanding her full attention. Her mind raced with questions and warnings, her body frozen yet alert, and the air was thick with anticipation, as if every falling flake and whisper of wind were part of a prelude she could not yet comprehend. Time stretched, moments elongating with the weight of possibility, danger, and unspoken recognition, and she realized the forest and the moonlight and the silver in his eyes were all conspiring to hold her in a delicate, perilous balance. She drew another careful breath, sensing the fragile thread of curiosity and fear coiling tighter with each second, and the tension pulsed between them like the quiet before a storm. The world beyond the grove seemed distant, irrelevant, as all attention centered on this silent, impossible man and the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She knew that the next movement, the next glance, could unravel her resolve, and yet a quiet part of her wanted to step closer, to understand, to survive this encounter not with flight but with unwavering presence. The grove held its breath, the altar stood witness, and Sarah was left suspended in a mixture of terror and intrigue, the unknown stretching before her like the endless, cold expanse of winter woods, her decision delayed, and the story of what was to come hanging, fragile and electrifying, in the silver dawn light. The first rays of dawn filtered through the tall pines, casting long, silver shadows across the winding path as Sarah stepped into the clearing beside Cale Thornridge. The air was crisp, biting at her exposed skin, yet her heart raced with a different kind of chill, an awareness that she was walking beside a man whose presence alone reshaped the world around her. Cale's eyes, metallic and unblinking, followed her every movement, a weight pressing against her chest, both commanding and strangely intimate. "You will stay until the storm passes," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. There was no malice in it, but no room for refusal either, and the words wrapped around her like an invisible tether, anchoring her to the moment and to him. The clearing felt smaller, almost suffocating, the towering trees closing in as if conspiring to make her proximity unavoidable. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing thoughts as she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, noting the rigid line of his shoulders, the faint tension in his jaw, and the careful control of every step he took. Each movement spoke volumes, discipline, power, the unyielding force of a man who had mastered his domain, and yet there was a subtle softness in the way he adjusted his coat to shield her from the wind, a gesture so quiet that it could have been mistaken for habit if she were not so attuned to every detail. Her own body responded, a mixture of instinctive fear and unbidden fascination making her pause mid-step, the snow crunching beneath her boots a sharp counterpoint to the silence that seemed to hum between them. The sunlight glinted off the frost-laden branches, casting flickering patterns across Cale's face and illuminating the subtle shift of his eyes as they tracked her, not with accusation, but with measured interest, an intensity that made her breath catch. She lifted her hands, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeves, an unconscious attempt to occupy herself, and he mirrored her with a subtle tilt of his head, the smallest motion, yet laden with command and expectation. The path ahead narrowed as the forest floor sloped gently upward, forcing them closer, and Sarah felt the magnetic pull of his proximity in every nerve ending, a tension that was both terrifying and undeniably compelling. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold earth, mingling with the faint warmth emanating from him, and she realized that despite the physical distance, there was an unspoken closeness, a bond forming in the quiet alignment of their steps. Each crunch of snow, each small shift in weight, each careful adjustment of the long coat created a rhythm, a cinematic dance of forced proximity where every detail conveyed emotion without a word. She sensed his attention lingering on her hands, her posture, the subtle tremor of her breath, and it brought a flush to her cheeks, awareness of being seen in a way that both frightened and intrigued her. The world beyond the forest felt distant, irrelevant, as if the clearing and the man beside her were the only points of gravity in the universe. Time stretched in measured increments, the pause between steps thick with unspoken possibilities, and she realized that her resolve, fragile yet determined, was entwined with the necessity of this forced closeness. Her eyes darted to the frozen brook that cut across the path, its surface reflecting the pale light, and she noted the way Cale's shadow fell beside hers, a silent guardian, a tether she could not break. The tension, unyielding and electric, pressed upon her senses, and she felt the weight of choice and inevitability converging as they moved together through the frost-kissed forest, each step carrying them further into an unknown intimacy, leaving her suspended in a delicate, unresolved balance between fear, curiosity, and reluctant trust, every nerve alive to the possibility that the next gesture, the next word, might shift everything and define the course of what was to come. The small cabin sat nestled among frost-laden pines, the first golden light of sunrise spilling through the windows, streaking across the worn wooden floorboards and illuminating motes of dust that drifted lazily in the still air. Sarah moved quietly, aware of Cale's presence behind her, the faint scrape of his boots against the floor a soft rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of her heart. "I never expected someone like you to care," she whispered, her voice tentative, almost lost in the hush of the morning. The words hung between them, fragile and vulnerable, yet they carried the weight of her observation, a subtle confession that pierced the distance he had maintained so far. Outside, snowflakes clung to the branches, trembling in the pale light, casting shifting shadows that danced across the walls, framing the moment as if the world itself had conspired to witness this fragile intimacy. Cale did not answer immediately, but the faint shift of his posture, the way his shoulders relaxed just fractionally, spoke louder than words. He moved toward the hearth, where a small fire had been coaxed to life, its flames flickering across his features, softening the hard angles that had seemed unyielding just hours before. The warmth of the fire mingled with the crisp chill of the morning air, and Sarah felt it brush against her cheeks, the contrast drawing her attention to the simple but profound reality of sharing this space with him. Cale extended a hand silently, a quiet gesture laden with meaning, offering a cup of tea that sent steam curling toward her face. When their fingers brushed as she accepted it, a shock of warmth passed through her, subtle but unmistakable, binding their proximity in a moment of unspoken understanding. She held the cup close, feeling the heat seep into her palms, and for a heartbeat, the world outside the cabin, the distant mountains, the frozen streams, the whispering pines, faded away, leaving only the small, charged circle of space they occupied. Her gaze flickered to the way he observed her, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the tilt of her chin, the subtle nervous intake of breath, and something in her chest clenched with the awareness that she was seen, fully, and yet not judged. The room seemed to contract, drawing them nearer without requiring movement, and the silence between them became a living entity, heavy with anticipation and curiosity. She felt the pull of something deeper than fear or obligation, a recognition of vulnerability that mirrored her own, and it made her pulse quicken in a measured, controlled way, tethering her attention to every micro-expression on his face. The firelight caught in his silver eyes, creating a luminous glow that softened the edges of his stern profile, revealing a hint of the hidden depth beneath the surface. The faint scent of pine and wood smoke, mingled with the subtle warmth of his presence, filled the room, creating a sensory tapestry that drew her senses into acute awareness. Every slight gesture, the tilt of his head, the subtle exhalation of breath, the careful alignment of his steps, was charged with an emotional resonance that made her stomach tighten, a dance of recognition and restraint unfolding without a single word being spoken. She shifted on her feet, adjusting the folds of her gown, and he allowed a small pause, the silence thick yet tender, as if inviting her to comprehend the intensity without breaking it apart with conversation. The moment stretched, elongated by shared understanding, the unspoken acknowledgment of care and attention threading through the space like the light through the frost-covered windows. Sarah felt herself suspended in the delicate tension, aware that the next motion, glance, or breath could tip the balance of their proximity into something even more intimate, yet the uncertainty held her captive, drawing her in with a mixture of awe, fear, and an unspoken longing. The scene remained unresolved, the firelight flickering against the walls and their shadows merging and separating in time with their quiet breaths, leaving her poised on the edge of curiosity, aware that this fragile bridge between them was only the beginning of a connection that demanded patience and attention, and that the deeper truths of Cale's presence were yet to be revealed. The first hints of morning sun spilled through the frost-streaked windows, dusting the cabin with a fragile glow that did little to warm the lingering chill. Sarah moved slowly, aware of the weight of every glance from Cale Thornridge, who remained near the hearth, his presence as imposing as it had been the night before, yet tempered now by subtle, watchful attentiveness. "You are stronger than I imagined," he murmured, his voice low, carrying an unfamiliar softness that did not compromise the authority behind it. The words, simple and measured, reverberated through the quiet cabin, and Sarah felt them settle around her chest, a mixture of recognition and unexpected admiration. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in patches where the sun struck, the light reflecting off the icy surfaces and casting fragmented, shifting shadows across the walls, creating a living tapestry of contrast and depth that mirrored the complexity of their connection. She held a bundle of herbs in her hands, the faint scent of pine and dried leaves mingling with the warmth emanating from the fire and the steady, grounding energy of Cale's presence. Each movement she made, brushing the strands of hair from her face, folding the herbs, arranging them carefully, was observed with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her own rhythm, her gestures suddenly amplified by the way he studied them, silently noting her competence and care. She glanced up at him, meeting the subtle flicker of his gaze, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken shifted. The fear that had threaded through her since the first night began to blend with a growing awareness of trust and admiration. Cale moved closer, each step deliberate and restrained, the faint scrape of his boots against the wooden floor punctuating the otherwise serene silence, and yet the air seemed charged with a new tension, a quiet electricity that neither spoke aloud. He positioned himself behind her as she prepared the herbs for tea, his proximity unavoidable but controlled, allowing her space while simultaneously asserting a protective presence. The heat from his body, the faint scent of his coat mingled with the pine and smoke, drew her senses into sharp focus, a mixture of nervousness and fascination threading through each breath. When he adjusted a blanket over her shoulders with a hand that was both gentle and commanding, her fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the intensity of being seen, acknowledged, and subtly revered by someone she had instinctively feared. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the light flickering across his face and accentuating the softened angles of his expression, revealing a glimpse of depth and history that stirred a complex blend of curiosity, caution, and awe within her. Every gesture, from the careful placement of his boots to the measured way he tilted his head to catch her movements, communicated a growing respect and silent admiration, threading through the quiet moments with the weight of significance. She paused, sensing that the shift was mutual, that he recognized her strengths even as he maintained the enigmatic barrier of his own control. Her pulse fluttered in rhythm with the subtle motions of the firelight and the gentle, deliberate cadence of his presence, each second layering an invisible tapestry of acknowledgment and unspoken connection. The snow outside reflected the sunlight in glimmering patches, echoing the flicker of warmth and trust that had begun to bridge the distance between them, and Sarah realized that something fundamental had begun to change, fear and awe mingling with a fragile admiration, and a tentative hope that perhaps this man, so formidable and distant, might not be entirely unreachable. Yet the cabin held its quiet tension, the shadows stretching along the walls, leaving her suspended in the delicate balance between admiration and uncertainty, curiosity and hesitation, as the first day of their tentative alliance stretched before them, unresolved, and charged with the promise of what was to come. The morning sun had fully risen over the silver pine clearing, its golden light cutting through the thin mist that clung to the forest floor, yet the warmth it brought did little to soothe the knot of tension tightening in Sarah's chest. She walked alongside Cale Thornridge, each step deliberate, the soft crunch of frost underfoot punctuating the thick, heavy silence between them. "I can manage on my own," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, though her eyes flicked nervously toward him. Cale's gaze, sharp and calculating, followed her every move, a storm of silver steel that seemed to pierce through her composure. The atmosphere was taut, charged with the unspoken weight of his presence and the expectation of the morning's journey. Beyond the trees, the distant sounds of the village stirring and the occasional cry of a bird reminded her that the world continued, indifferent to the quiet turbulence that circled them. Snow-laden branches brushed against each other in the soft breeze, sending scattered flakes drifting like tiny sparks of white across their path, and Sarah's hands instinctively clenched at her coat. Cale did not respond immediately, his expression unreadable, yet the subtle tightening of his jaw and the faint narrowing of his eyes conveyed an intensity that left her simultaneously unsettled and alert. "You are relying too much on others," he said finally, his tone measured, each word precise, neither accusation nor praise, but heavy with expectation. She forced herself to lift her chin, meeting his gaze for a moment before looking away toward the forest floor, the sunlight catching the pale frost and casting fractured patterns across the path. "I have to," she murmured, the words barely audible over the whisper of wind and the soft, rhythmic crunch of their boots against the frozen earth. The tension between them was like a taut wire, vibrating with the conflict of trust and independence, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken with each step, aware that every movement and every pause was observed, assessed, weighed. Cale adjusted the scarf around her neck without a word, his fingers brushing her shoulder lightly, a protective yet commanding gesture that forced proximity, binding them in a shared space without the need for dialogue. She shivered, partly from the cold, partly from the awareness of being so closely scrutinized, and the complex flutter of emotions it stirred, fear, admiration, restraint, and an unspoken challenge. The path wound upward, narrowing between ancient pines, and their shadows merged on the snow-covered ground, stretching long and sharp in the morning light, a visual echo of the tension threading through the air. A distant howl carried through the forest, a reminder of the wild, untamed presence surrounding them, and Sarah felt a subtle tightening in her chest, the instinctive caution of an omega aware of both danger and protection. Cale's posture remained rigid, each movement calculated, yet there was a subtle shift, a recognition of her strength in his silent observation. The silence spoke volumes, neither would yield, neither would speak unnecessarily, and yet each understood the unspoken rules that governed this fragile alliance. Sarah's breath misted in the cold air, visible evidence of the quiet storm of emotions swirling between them, and she realized that the path ahead, both literal and metaphorical, would demand resilience, attention, and a delicate balance of trust and caution. The sun climbed higher, glinting off frost and ice, but the light did not dispel the heavy atmosphere. Instead, it highlighted every movement, every unspoken exchange, every subtle gesture of assessment and restraint, leaving Sarah suspended in the intricate web of emotions that bound them together. She took another cautious step, aware that each moment drew them closer not only to their destination but to a new understanding of the tension, the protection, and the unspoken power at play, leaving her poised between hesitation and inevitability, the uncertainty stretching forward like the forest path into the unknown, unresolved, and electrifying in its potential. The forest clearing had grown quieter as the sun climbed higher, the pale light spilling through the frost-tipped pines in scattered beams that glimmered against the remaining patches of snow. Sarah stood frozen for a heartbeat, absorbing the weight of the morning and the silent presence of Cale Thornridge beside her. His eyes, silver and unyielding, tracked her movements, yet the rigidity she had grown accustomed to softened in an imperceptible way. "You are safe with me," he said quietly, the words carrying a low resonance that seemed meant for her ears alone, a declaration that cut through the residual tension of the night and the unspoken conflict of the morning. The sound was a tether, pulling her awareness away from the biting cold and the endless forest beyond, grounding her in the immediacy of his presence. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the sunbeams, catching the light and illuminating his expression in fragmented flashes, revealing the subtle vulnerability hidden beneath the disciplined exterior he always maintained. Sarah's breath caught as she registered the shift, the way his shoulders, so often rigid and commanding, relaxed fractionally, and she felt the first tremors of a connection that went beyond the cautious respect they had established. Cale stepped closer, not abruptly, but with a deliberate slowness that amplified the gravity of his proximity, the crunch of his boots against the frozen ground punctuating each careful movement. The wind carried a faint scent of pine and frost, mingling with the warmth radiating from his coat, and she realized that the space between them was charged with an intimacy neither dared to define yet. Her fingers instinctively adjusted the edge of her coat as he lowered himself beside her on the fallen log, their knees nearly touching, yet there was no intrusion, only a shared presence that made the silence speak volumes. The forest itself seemed to lean in, the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs emphasizing the stillness, framing the moment like a scene painted in motionless light and sound. Sarah's gaze flicked to his hands resting loosely on his knees, and she noticed the faint tremor in his fingers, a subtle detail that spoke of restraint and quiet tension. She shifted slightly, hesitant to break the fragile equilibrium, and he responded with a small nod, an acknowledgment of her presence, of her autonomy within the closeness he imposed. Their eyes met, and the weight of unspoken understanding passed between them, a recognition that each had begun to unravel the careful facades they maintained, revealing glimpses of the vulnerability and trust slowly threading through the space. Cale's breath fogged in the crisp air as he spoke again, the low timbre resonating against the stillness. "I have not allowed anyone this close before." The admission, minimal yet loaded, sent a shiver through her, an awareness of the rare privilege and responsibility inherent in the moment. Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse quickening, sensing the delicate balance between the guarded predator he remained and the tentative openness he offered only to her. The clearing was bathed in the shifting patterns of light and shadow, each snowflake and sunbeam a reflection of the complex, unfolding tension, and as she turned slightly to adjust the scarf around her neck, she felt the warmth of his presence linger at her side, an invisible hand holding the space between them, protective and demanding attention at once. Time seemed suspended, elongated by the weight of connection and the tentative breakthrough of emotion, leaving her poised between hesitation and trust, the forest breathing around them as a witness to a fragile intimacy that had taken root but was far from fully realized, and the uncertainty of how far this bond could stretch remained suspended in the soft morning light, beckoning the next step into revelation and deeper connection. The forest clearing was quiet, the golden light of late morning filtering through the pine boughs and catching on frost-laden branches, scattering tiny reflections across the snow-dusted ground. Sarah moved slowly, feeling the gravity of each step as Cale Thornridge remained beside her, an ever-present figure of commanding strength and careful restraint. "You are safe with me," he murmured, his voice low, resonant, meant only for her, a quiet declaration that carried both reassurance and weight. The words settled over her like a protective cloak, and for the first time, the rigid tension that had threaded through every interaction began to loosen, replaced by a fragile, dangerous intimacy. Cale's eyes, silver and sharp, flicked over her, catching the sunlight and reflecting it back with a luminous intensity that left her breathless, yet softened in subtle ways that spoke of an unspoken vulnerability. The cold forest air was filled with the faint scent of pine and melting snow, mingling with the warmth radiating from his presence, drawing her attention to the closeness she could not ignore. He moved beside her to a fallen log, seating himself carefully, each motion precise yet measured with an uncharacteristic gentleness, and without a word, he beckoned her to sit nearby. Sarah's knees brushed against the log as she lowered herself, aware of the weight of proximity, the magnetic pull of his controlled presence, and the silent, shared space that neither had claimed but both inhabited fully. The sun glinted off frost crystals on the surrounding trees, casting fleeting patterns across his face, highlighting the subtle shift in expression, a slackening at the jawline, a small softening of his gaze that hinted at trust, at acknowledgment of her strength. Her pulse quickened as she registered the delicate change, the silent communication that spoke louder than any dialogue could. She was seen, not just observed, and the recognition carried the power to undo her defenses. The wind rustled softly through the pines, a gentle background chorus to the quiet heartbeat between them, and she felt her body respond to the rhythm of shared presence, the fragile barrier of distance giving way to something raw, palpable, and unspoken. Cale extended a hand to steady her as she adjusted her coat, their fingers brushing in a fleeting touch, the warmth and strength of his palm sending a jolt through her chest that resonated deeper than the cold around them. The forest held its breath, the snow-covered ground reflecting fragmented beams of sunlight, and Sarah realized that in the space between them, every subtle motion, every measured exhalation, every shared glance carried a resonance that tethered them together with invisible threads of trust and recognition. The log beneath them creaked slightly as he shifted, and the sound seemed amplified in the hush, punctuating the delicate intimacy that had formed in silence, in proximity, in the shared, careful rhythm of breaths and movement. Her eyes met his once more, and for the first time, she allowed herself to see not the cold, unyielding alpha, but a man capable of restraint, depth, and recognition, a dangerous tenderness that demanded her full attention. Time seemed suspended in the hush of the forest clearing, sunlight dancing across their shadows, the snow sparkling like frozen stars, and she felt poised at the edge of revelation, every nerve alert to the fragile chemistry and unspoken understanding, knowing that the next movement, the next gesture, could tip the balance of this tentative intimacy into a new, undeniable connection, leaving her suspended, caught between curiosity and longing. The morning stretched before them with unresolved tension and promise of deeper truths yet to be discovered. The evening had settled over the cabin, casting long shadows that stretched across the worn wooden floor and the rough-hewn walls, painted golden and amber by the fading sun. Sarah sat quietly near the window, the fabric of her coat brushing against her knees, her gaze fixed on the pale streaks of light sliding over the frost-coated branches outside. Her heart throbbed with the weight of unspoken thoughts, the delicate tension of the day lingering in her chest like a storm held at bay. Is it wrong to feel this for him? She whispered softly, barely audible over the gentle rustle of pine needles in the evening breeze. The words seemed to float into the warm, dim air, unanswered, yet charged with the gravity of everything she had begun to understand. Cale Thornridge remained still across the room, partially obscured by the shadows, his form immense and silent, the rigid lines of his shoulders softened only by the subtle awareness that his presence demanded hers. He had not moved closer, but she felt the weight of proximity as though it were a tangible force pressing gently against her awareness, drawing her attention to the unspoken between them. The flicker of candlelight caught on the angles of his jaw, illuminating the faint trace of tension that still lingered in his expression, a reminder of the controlled restraint that defined him. Sarah shifted slightly, her fingers clutching the edge of the window sill, the warmth of her hands failing to reach the cold knot of hesitation in her stomach. The room felt suspended, each sound amplified, the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth, the distant chirp of a bird settling for the night, the measured exhalation of her own breath. When she turned slightly, she caught the faint gleam of his silver eyes in the flickering light, reflecting not just her image but the pulse of her uncertainty, a mirror of the hesitation that had taken root within her. Cale's gaze held her for a long moment, unreadable, yet full of quiet insistence, and in that silence, she felt the magnitude of the unspoken truth between them, the fragile connection that had grown through moments of shared space, small gestures, and subtle acknowledgments. She dared not move closer, not yet, though the magnetic pull of proximity drew her attention irresistibly, a whisper of what might come if she allowed herself to surrender to the weight of trust and curiosity. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she considered the depth of the morning, the fragile bridge of understanding that had begun to form, and the possibility that the man across the room, so powerful, so measured, so impossibly controlled, was tethered to her in ways she could not yet fully name. The shadows on the floor shifted as he moved slightly, not approaching, but adjusting his position in a careful, deliberate dance that mirrored the subtle rhythms of her own hesitation, the space between them charged with a delicate balance of anticipation and restraint. Outside, the forest lay quiet beneath the twilight sky, the branches casting long, dark fingers across the snow, mirroring the tension that stretched taut in the room, each shadow a reminder of unspoken possibilities. Sarah's gaze flicked back to the firelight, to the warmth that did not reach her hesitation, and she realized that the moment was poised on a knife edge, a fragile juncture between confession and silence, proximity and distance, awareness and restraint. Every movement, every breath, every subtle flicker of expression held weight, and she understood that the next step, the next glance, the next choice, could unravel the delicate tension entirely, leaving her suspended between longing and caution, curiosity and fear, as the evening deepened and the shadows stretched, unresolved, toward the coming night. The ceremonial hall glowed with a pale, sacred light, sunlight filtering through towering stained glass windows and scattering kaleidoscopic patterns across the marble floor. Silver threads of candlelight flickered along the intricate carvings of the royal hall, where the royal council and nobles from across the kingdom had gathered, their whispers hushed by awe and anticipation. Sarah stood before the altar, her hands trembling slightly as she held the scroll containing the ancient bond words. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed upon her, yet beneath it lay a quiet clarity, her choice, her voice, her acceptance of this destiny. Cale Thornridge stood across from her, his frame still immense, the dark cloak around his shoulders absorbing the light, yet the silver of his eyes softened as they met hers, attentive, unyielding, yet restrained in the most compelling way. I claim you, he murmured, voice low but carrying the authority of every pack and kingdom under his rule. Sarah's lips parted as she spoke the ancient bond words aloud, her voice steady, echoing through the hall. By this bond, I stand with you, willingly, as mate and equal, in the eyes of all who witness. The moment seemed to stretch, every breath held in the silence, every heartbeat echoing in the cavernous hall. Cale's expression, long measured and controlled, shifted imperceptibly. A flicker of emotion crossed his features, almost human in its rawness. His hands, previously folded at his sides, moved slowly, deliberate, until they found hers, their fingers intertwining. The electricity of the moment was restrained, intense, a dangerous tenderness that spoke of protection and devotion. The royal council's eyes widened in recognition of the sacred bond ceremony's completion, and murmurs rippled through the assembly, but all attention remained on the pair. Cale knelt, not in submission, but in a gesture of solemn reverence, pressing his forehead to the back of Sarah's hand, a quiet, cinematic affirmation of their union. His gaze rose, locking with hers, unwavering and commanding. You are mine, he said softly, the words layered with possessive care, authority, and devotion, yet gentle enough to allow her autonomy. Sarah's pulse quickened, yet she held his gaze, nodding slightly, her voice a whisper of conviction, and I choose you. The hall seemed to exhale with them, the sunlight catching the edges of their shadows, stretching long across the marble, a visual echo of their intertwined destinies. Guests leaned forward, sensing the culmination of centuries-old traditions, but the intimacy between the Alpha and his Omega remained private, sacred, and monumental. The candlelight shimmered across Cale's hand as he lifted it to Sarah's cheek, his touch soft yet commanding, and she leaned slightly, pressing her forehead to his in a delicate, lingering contact, their breaths mingling briefly, the quietest of promises conveyed in silence. A herald from the royal council stepped forward, announcing the bond to the kingdom, but the words barely registered to them. The world had narrowed to the two of them, bound by choice, tradition, and fate. Outside, the winter sun glinted off the high towers of the palace, and the wind stirred the banners above the hall, a ceremonial applause of nature itself. Cale's hand remained around hers, his eyes never leaving hers, a testament to the completion of a journey that began in fear, moved through tension, vulnerability, and trust, and now culminated in a cinematic, emotional resolution. Every heartbeat, every breath, every touch spoke of a future shared, of an unbreakable bond, and as they stood together, the light catching the edges of their forms in the grand hall, it was clear, the Alpha and Omega had found their destiny, sealed by ancient bond words, witnessed by the sacred bond ceremony, and cemented in each other's choice, a final, cathartic affirmation of love, protection, and mutual devotion.